These words are from a book by a historian named Jon Meacham. The book is called The Soul of America. The war between the ideal and the real, between what's right and what's convenient, between the larger good and personal interest, is the contest that unfolds in the soul of every American. The message of Dr. King that we should be judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin, dwells in the American soul. Philosophically speaking, the soul is the vital center, the core, the heart, the essence of life. Heroes and martyrs have such a vital center. So do killers and haters. Socrates believed the soul was nothing less than the animating force of reality. What is it that present in a body makes it living? He asked. The answer was brief and epical: a soul. In the second chapter of the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, the soul was life itself. And the Lord God formed women and men from the dust of the ground and breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and each became a living soul. I hate to bring us all back down to earth. That was wonderful. What a gift. The choir, the violin, the piano, wow. What a gift for Sunday morning. So it's nice to be back. As some of you know, I've been here a number of times, always gratefully received and grateful for the opportunity to share our message. I'm never quite sure whether to preach from here or there, but in conferring with some of you, I got the impression that if I preach from there, I'm a Baptist, and if I preach from here, I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And so I thought it's probably safer to be down here, right? And if you go up there, maybe it just sets a different tone. I didn't want to do that. So it's fascinating to me that in our modern scientific 21st century world, in which the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not nuns, N-U-N-S, are growing, and religious congregations sadly diminishing, that the word soul has been recently used by historians and politicians to refer to something they deem important to the concerns of the nation. You might say, even in these supposedly enlightened times, that the notion of soul is making a comeback. And as a former monk and spiritual writer and now therapist, Thomas More has suggested, the soul not only refers to the personal dimension of each of our lives, but that the nation and the world have a soul. And I think, whatever could that mean? In a former time, some of us grew up with a very deep sense of having a soul, an entity, we thought, an entity, which we were taught would survive even when our bodies died out. Our job was to keep our soul pure, immaculate, free of the stain of sin, which some of us would do by going to confession, sometimes weekly, to the priest and receive absolution. A medieval theologian named Aquinas taught us that the soul was immortal and the first principle of life. Aquinas thought the soul was rational, part of the world, that integrated our understanding, our ability to evaluate, to make decisions, to implement desires. But the soul was also, he argued, transcendent, our connection to the divine, if you will, at its best helping us to develop good habits, virtue, though also capable of serious transgressions. But in our modern enlightened scientific world, what Aquinas and others based notions of the existence of the soul on, the philosophical branch of thinking that we refer to as metaphysics, doesn't really fly so easily. It can't be verified or examined, so maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe it's not real. Human are material beings, after all, not transcendent. Some in the modern age will tell us. Maybe it's time to let go of such superstitions. Nevertheless, seems like in our postmodern world of the 21st century, the notion of a personal, national, even worldly soul maybe has some reality to it, at least for some. As scientific types grapple as to just how to explain human consciousness, ever a mystery, there is an opening for serious talk about what mystics refer to as the soul, as our very ground of consciousness. The true self, if you will, our connectedness to the holy, the spark of divine. Even Albert Einstein can help us here, as he once stated, "The more I study physics, the more I'm drawn to metaphysics." No one I'm aware of has written more about the soul than the aforementioned Thomas More. In one of his many books, The Education of the Heart, he describes the soul in this way: the creative and constructive source of life, as mysterious as life itself and beyond definition. It's what makes us human, where we try to develop ourselves fully fulfilling our potential. It's the source of passions, of our identity, of our energy and vitality. It's a perspective, not a substance, a perspective, a way to see things. A viewpoint toward things rather than a thing itself, a viewpoint. It's reflective, it mediates events and makes differences between ourselves and everything that happens, between the doer and the deed. There is this reflective moment, and soul-making means differentiating that middle ground. He continues, the soul is that mysterious dimension of our personalities and lived in lives that we will never really fully understand, but yet plays an influential role in our lives. The great Irish playwright Oscar Wilde said that the soul of a person is unknowable. And this realization, he says, is the ultimate achievement of wisdom. Because the final mystery is oneself. And he concludes, only the shallow know themselves. Only the shallow know themselves. But one thing I never remember being told growing up was that the nation had a soul. If that's the case, I thought maybe the nation has to repent like some of us did from childhood. Go see the priest or the priestess, the imam or the rabbi, confess one's sins and do penance or reparations, and feel the pain and torture some of us felt every Saturday afternoon waiting to go into that confession box. So Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Donald Trump, maybe George Santos, and maybe Putin, are you ready to atone? Do any of us remember during the Democratic debates in 2020, the presidential debates, there was a candidate named Marianne Williamson. If you were looking at the screen, she was way on the end. Rarely referred to. But I do remember being intrigued by her perspective. But I didn't really know what to make of her. A prolific author, by the way, highly educated, but I thought maybe her stuff was a little too new agey or dreamy, esoteric, not really serious political commentary. But I liked what she was saying. Very different than anyone on the stage. More mystical than political. Somewhat utopian, but then I think that was her point. Politics needs some mysticism, some spirituality, some soulfulness. It got me reading one of her books called Healing the Soul of America. We must bring soulfulness and hope to politics, she argues. It's the key to democratic renewal. Politics is meant to care for the public good, the common good. But the social systems we live in are sick. And this affects us all, she writes. It's not just our childhoods or family dysfunctions that we're so well aware of that influence us. It's our educational system, our government, our business structures, which are often quite dysfunctional in a manner that affects us all. Attention to our soul, she continues, has been marginalized by a materialistic focus. It's time to retrieve our souls. The nation needs soul oxygen. We need to recreate politics as a mystical pursuit. Bringing some of this soul thinking to date, though from a different perspective than Williamson, is the noted historian Jon Meacham, from whom I read earlier, in a book called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. Meacham suggests that the impetus for us writing such a book is not that past American presidents have always risen to the occasion of putting the best of our country's values, that is, serving our better angels, an expression you remember from Abraham Lincoln, but because the incumbent president, referring to the fellow who was in from 216 to 220, because the incumbent president so rarely does. In our finest hours, the soul of the country manifests itself in an inclination to open our arms rather than clench our fists, to look out rather than turn inward, to accept rather than to reject. To speak of a soul at all, writes Meacham, either of a person or a country, can seem speculative and gauzy. Yet belief in the existence of an immanent collection of convictions, dispositions, and sensitivities that shape our character and inform conduct is ancient and perennial. Like Marianne Williamson and Dr. King, Meacham cites key documents in our history that bespeak of a set of values, or, if you will, bespeak what makes up, what constitutes the soul of the nation. He calls it the American Creed, the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, maybe Kennedy's inaugural address, certainly King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and maybe Sojourner's Truth, "Ain't I a woman?" A great sociologist, Robert Bellah, who wrote often of the problem of individualism in America and the need for community and a communal perspective, and the lack of attention to the common good, Bellah would call such documents civil religion. There's something sacred about these documents. They bespeak the soul of the country. How often, after the Capitol was breached, did certain politicians refer to that building as a sacred space? Even recognizing the huge warts of these documents and the warts of those who constructed them, excluding all sorts of people of color, of women, Dr. King still called us fully to implement the values the documents proclaimed. He had this dream, as we know, still unrealized. Meacham refers to these documents, as I mentioned, as a creed, an American creed. And while he applauds the centrality of them in what makes up our nation's soul, he prefers the word soul to creed, because the former is just a set of beliefs, whereas the soul is a center of action that acts on those beliefs. We're called, he said, to act on our better angels. Our very character lies in the soul, this vital center, this essence of life, life itself, according to Genesis. Citing one of his American heroes, John Lewis, who came up with this wonderful expression, "We need to cause good trouble." Don't you love that? Good trouble. John Lewis. Meacham speaks of Lewis, of grace, of love, of godliness and generosity, our better angels, versus racism, hatred, fear, and cruelty, the darker angels. Williamson and Meacham suggest that the real enemy is fear. Fear. Especially stoked by so many now in the political realm. Writes Meacham, extremism, racism, nativism, and isolationism, driven by the fear of the unknown, tend to spike in periods of economic and social upheaval, maybe like our own. Not too long ago, I was at a small gathering of friends and family, and we became engaged in a somewhat contentious discussion about the state of the nation. At one point, I said, I thought our immigration policy was pretty shameful. And I suggested Germany is this beacon of light who a couple of years ago decided they would take in 1 million refugees. Now, Germany's probably 1/6 the size of our country, or maybe 1/4, I'm not sure, but certainly not more than 1/4 of the size. And they took in 1 million refugees, Germany. I said, that seems to me we could incorporate several million. Actually, you know, on the news about 6 months ago, there was a fellow on the border with a sign saying, "Open the borders." And when he was interviewed by one of the channels on national news, they said, "Are you really serious? You want to open the borders? What do you mean?" He said, "Listen, my solution to this problem is get every company in our nation down to that border and start hiring these people because all they want is jobs." And I thought, boy, there's a brilliant insight by an ordinary person like any one of us. So at this little gathering, I suggested we could incorporate several million. In fact, I said, every one of us around the table could house one immigrant, a refugee, and help feed them and help get them work, right? And one of the participants says, "No, I couldn't." And I responded, "I think you could." And he said louder, "No, I couldn't." And I sensed fear in his voice at the thought of housing someone from another world. I sensed real fear. You know, I noticed, although it hasn't gotten as much play as I wish it had, the current president has suggested some kind of a new policy on hospitality, encouraging individuals and communities to welcome refugees. I think he called it the Welcoming Corps or something like that. Encouraging people, almost admitting that the government can't do all of this. We all need to be part of this. And you know, I know in a lot of communities, I know in Gloucester, Gloucester's taken in a number of Afghani refugees and found them apartments and work and so forth. And I thought, maybe this is really a new moment. But I also thought more recently, with this horrible disaster in Turkey and Syria, this earthquake, and the many thousands of people who haven't survived. I heard on the news in the last couple of days, over 100 nations are sending supplies and people and efforts to rescue people still. And I thought, isn't it curious that the soul of nations emerges in crises so well? We come together, and for a moment at least, we forget our differences and our wars, and we come to help in a moment of crisis. Almost curiously, that we constantly need a crisis so that we can act as our better angels would act. Am I optimistic? I'm not sure. Am I hopeful? Always hopeful. Mostly because I do see such good energy and activism for good. I was thinking back to the election time in Georgia. I don't think a few years back we could ever imagine that Georgia would elect 2 senators, one a Jew and one an African American. Quite an amazing moment when people organize and gather and put energy in the right direction. There's gridlock in Congress, there's impasse, there's deep division, not only in our nation, but in our families. And it probably won't end soon. But I'm reminded every time I reread the Bible, which I do with some frequency, both Older and Newer Testaments, Jewish and Christian, that the prophets and Jesus and the early Christian community all faced great conflict as they spread a word of love. And it's true of Harriet Tubman, talk about conflict, the Moses of her people, Frederick Douglass, Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Dr. King, Archbishop Romero, all faced great conflict, as we will when we try to fight racism, when we rethink our history, really look at what happened in these last years. Economic inequality, as immigrants pour into our country. There will be conflict. There is conflict. But even though so many of us are disappointed in our political leadership, I'm reminded, ironies, Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist. FDR was not a union-oriented labor activist. LBJ was not a civil rights activist. And Joe Biden could never be mistaken for a left-wing socialist. But over and over, these people have spoken to restoring the soul of our nation and have done some good things. They rose to the occasion, addressed the historical moment, and despite the unlikelihood of their accomplishments, they did bring us greater hope. So there is hope, and I'm hopeful. I don't know if any of you know the expression or use the expression that so-and-so is an old soul, implying that certain people, sometimes very young people, seem to have wisdom beyond their years and their experiences. When I heard the young poetess Amanda Gorman speak 2 weeks after the insurrection in Washington at Joe Biden's inauguration, I thought, that young woman is an old soul. Just the soul-filled kind of person we need to hear from in a time of turmoil. Her words filled my soul, and I suspect the soul of the nation. If you remember, she entitled her poem, "The Hill We Climb." Her words call us to heal the soul of the nation. Here are just a few. She reminds us we as a nation are unfinished. We're a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother, can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. Although Ms. Gorman suggests we are far from polished, we must attempt to forge a union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of human beings. If we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy. And with every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one, and we will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. Even if we are battered, we are beautiful, and never forget that. There is always light, if only we are brave enough to see it, if only we are brave enough to be it. Words of an old soul, speaking to the soul of a nation. So, friends, don't let anyone tell you the soul doesn't exist.